Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Science Factory. Today, our guest is Nicky Nielsen. Welcome, Nicky.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Dr. Nicky Nielsen is born in Denmark. He's an Egyptologist working at the University of Manchester. He did his national service in the Royal Guards of the Danish Army before moving to the United Kingdom to undertake a BA, MA, and last but not least, a PhD in Egyptology, all at the University of Liverpool. He specializes in ancient Egyptian material culture, in particular ceramics, from the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, so it's a wide range. And he is the field director of the Tell Nabasha Project and has written several books about ancient Egyptian history and culture. So you have a very interesting and deep profile. We wanted to start by your personal and academic background.
hmm
So, as I said in this short introduction, you served in the Royal Guards of the Danish Army before moving to the UK to
hmm
pursue your academic career. How did that experience shape your perspective, and has it influenced your work as an archaeologist?
a little bit, not as an archaeologist per se, but I have done quite a lot of work on Egyptian military history, either tangentially or directly. So my PhD, for instance, was about the fortress at Sauid Raqam and specifically about the provisioning of the fortress. And to be honest, I think obviously this is national service, right? So it's something you kind of have to do. But I was always quite fascinated by the logistics involved in armies, the all the stuff you don't see. How do you actually get people from point A to point B? How do you make sure they don't die from starvation and thirst? How do you bring supplies? All this kind of stuff, and that impacted my PhD quite a lot in this sense of how do you actually, so Sauid Raqam is 300 miles from Alexandria. How do you actually maintain a population of soldiery that far away from the Nile Valley with these immensely long supply lines? So that's something that I picked up already back then. I was always quite fascinated by the stuff you don't really see. I'm not terribly interested in battles, I have to admit, when it comes to military history, but I'm very interested in the lead up to them, and how you actually organize yourselves.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. As you were saying, it's a different approach. Like we are more attracted normally, I guess, to the battles themselves, but
I think we tend to
all
see
the
that,
rest, the
yeah, as
background, it's kind of even more difficult to see, I guess, because what kind of remains or what kind of information you can work with regarding to this topic.
yeah, I mean, in the case of Sawid or Moroccan, it was things like using portable XRF analysis to identify how much of the pottery was locally produced, which showed us that about half the pottery there was actually produced locally, despite the fact that we have no installations, we have no evidence of kilns or anything like that. So presumably they were in a secondary position outside the fortress. Things like we had a lot of flint blades, sickle blades for harvesting, but there is no river there. So how do Egyptians who are used to inundation-based agriculture, how do they fare when it comes to growing wheat and barley in wadis that are rain-fed agriculture, for instance? So all these kind of questions of how do you adapt to your local environment in these very liminal areas.
What led you to pursue all three degrees, the BA, MA, and PhD, at the University of Liverpool? What did that continuity offer you in terms of research and mentorship?
I mean, initially Liverpool attracted me because they had active excavations in Egypt. I'm not much of a linguist. I was always interested in the more kind of archaeological side, cultural, historical side. Um, uh, Liverpool was partly because it's a very good university. I was very fond of the staff there. Partly because I succeeded in getting funding for my MA and my PhD. And as with everything in academia, you go where the money is. That's the rule essentially. So that's part of it. But also my research area, my research interests fitted well with the staff at the university, which is always important to consider when you're doing a PhD. So, Sawid Murakam, the site was excavated by Professor Stephen Snape at Liverpool. So that's where the material was as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And talking about your research, You specialize in ancient Egyptian material culture, particularly ceramics from the New Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period. What can pottery tell us about ancient Egyptian society that other sources might not?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I think there are several different areas here. So there's something about function and use, and there's something about dating and chronology. There's lots of different areas where pottery is in many cases the only kind of good tool that we have. So, as an example from our later season at Nabasha, so we found a little area with a fire pit or hearth, with a late period cooking pot still standing in the kind of embers of the hearth or the coals of the hearth, with these flat discs, ceramic discs laid all around it. And these discs are used as bread platters. They're used for leavening bread. Similar way to what's done in southern Egypt today. The cooking pot was of a specific type that's characteristic of the later part of the late period. And when we emptied it out and excavated the contents of the pot, we found fish bones, tilapia fish bones inside the pot. The pottery here, because it has essentially, it's almost like a snapshot in time. Someone was sitting there cooking fish stew and, had bread ready out in the sun. Maybe it was being carried off to an oven to be baked. So that's one thing that pottery can do. It can tell us something about these very everyday things that I find endlessly fascinating, because it tends to, it isn't as well represented as, the development of coffin texts or stuff like that. But I really enjoy these everyday little moments that you occasionally get in the archaeological record, and pottery is often at the kind of at the core of that. Another example, actually from the same trench, one of the ways we dated the trench and dated the structures was one of the houses that we uncovered had basically collapsed on top into a street. Sort of the wall had collapsed into a street and trapped a very large broken Athenian amphora, which had been standing, probably leaned up against the house wall, and as it collapsed, it kind of got trapped under all the rubble. It was called a mushroom rim amphora, which it actually really usefully, the shape of the rim changes from the 5th to the mid 4th century BCE. So by looking at the shape of the rim, you can actually narrow down a date pretty accurately to when this was left there. Obviously, things like an amphora like that, you're probably going to keep. You're not necessarily going to throw out. You're going to reuse it. So it's probably going to be kept for a while. You don't just decant it and then chuck it in the midden. You kind of recycle it. But nevertheless, the particular type was of a type that we find most commonly around the mid 4th century BCE. So that gave us a really good kind of date for, okay, well, someone must have been there at that point, because they must have put the amphora up against the house wall. So that gives us an idea about when the area was abandoned and when the building subsequently collapsed, which I'm guessing is towards the later part of the 4th century BCE.
Okay, so it gives us a lot of information and
Yeah,
also about society, about the food they ate, about also the commercial relationships they had with
absolutely.
other villages
And
around
and
or
the
even abroad.
type of kind of the socioeconomic status of the people living there. So in another trench we excavated previously, not too far from this one, we found a lot of pottery, including imported Levantine pottery and Hellenistic pottery, as we would expect. We only found, out of literally thousands of sherds of pottery, we only found a single piece of the really nice Greek black glazed attic ware. And it was actually a fragment of a lectus vessel, usually associated with funerary rituals in the Hellenistic world. But the slightly weird thing is that this was a sort of late 4th century BCE context, but the lectus was probably 6th or 5th century BCE. So that thing had been kept for generations given its rarity value, probably because this was like an heirloom, in the way that people collect Wedgwood plates or things like that. And that tells us maybe something about the people who lived then, about their socioeconomic status. They weren't able to get, vast amounts of really nice, expensive imported pottery and really beautifully decorated stuff. So the little that they had was really cherished.
I can imagine. And have you observed any notable shifts in ceramic production or usage across those periods that challenge existing narratives?
I don't think existing narratives as such. I mean, I think we get a little bit worked up about pottery sometimes in a couple of different ways. First of all, this tendency we've had, and that's entirely ceramicists love putting things in boxes. We love categorizing things because that's part of how you do a typology, but it can become too rigid. If you're talking about Middle Kingdom pottery and New Kingdom pottery as these inflexible monolithic terms, it masks things like regional variation. It masks the actual innovation and the imagination of the potters themselves. Yes, there are shapes that are preferred, and there are shapes that are replicated across all sites in Egypt. Things like funnel neck jars during the New Kingdom, they're just everywhere. It's a popular shape. But that doesn't mean that there aren't unique shapes where a potter just felt like doing something different or wanted to experiment with something or made something for a very specific situation rather than something that was, these aren't mass produced in the sense that, a sort of car assembly plant. So I think we tend to maybe get a little bit too rigid in our definitions, and that can hide a lot of what's going on at a much more kind of granular level. The same thing with pottery fabrics. So obviously, part of ceramic studies is discussion of pottery fabrics, and famously the Vienna system and the various developments of that. But having worked with potters, actual potters today, one thing that strikes me is the degree to which everything is by feel. You don't write down the recipe for your favorite clay, or your favorite mixture of clay and in grog and straw and whatever. You do it by feel. How does it feel in the hand? Because maybe this batch of clay is slightly more wet, it requires a bit more sand. So, if we get wrapped into these discussions of, well, there is, 63% sand in this, then it must be this thing. I think it takes
Doesn't work
away
like that.
it's not quite like that. The Egyptian potters are not sitting there and writing careful recipes about precise percentages of different inclusions that go into their clay. By the same token, it's not like when the 12th dynasty roll around, all of the potters in Egypt just go, oh, we're the Middle Kingdom. We'd better stop making bag-shaped pottery. We have to start making another shape. Like, these are modern artificial divisions, and I think we make a mistake if we get too rigid about those.
I understand that those typologies or classifications are necessary in order to make the understanding easier, but you're totally right that it
Absolutely,
can be
yes.
too rigid sometimes, and you need to move between the limits and not
Yeah.
stick
I, I,
into
I,
the
I think
traditional classification.
be aware that they're there, because the typology is useful, because otherwise you get into this situation that you have in some museums where every single ceramic vessel is just listed as pot, which is not helpful to anyone. So we do need to, agree, okay, what is a dish, what is a plate, what's a funnel neck jar, what's a beer jar, all of these different, but I think it can get too rigid if we forget that these are our definitions, not the Egyptians.
Talking about Tell Nabasha Project, you're currently directing excavations at Tell Nabasha. For those unfamiliar with the site, could you give us a brief overview of its historical significance?
So it's a regional capital in the northeastern Nile Delta. So in ancient times, it's known as Imet. In terms of occupation, the earliest material from the site, which was found in the 70s, was early dynastic graves. So there's certainly activity in the area from the early dynastic onwards, probably a bit earlier. Imet is known in the textual record from the Old Kingdom onwards, mainly associated with wine and wine production. We don't archaeologically have anything really from the Old and Middle Kingdom. We have some Middle Kingdom material that's been recycled during later periods, but nothing really substantial. The main parts of the site is the big temple of Wajet, snake goddess of Lower Egypt, along with a smaller temple of Minosiris, which is kind of temple district. Those we know that they were that they were functioning during the 18th dynasty, but the actual construction was probably Ramesside. And then, the surviving construction is Ramesside, and then it was refurbished in the late period by Amasis II, who added a big monolithic shrine. There's also a vast cemetery dating from the Ramesside period, really to the Byzantine period, that was excavated by Flinders Petrie in 1886, and also by the Egypt Antiquities Service, pretty much from 1905 onwards at various times. And then there was a settlement area that Petrie, in a very Petrie fashion, looked at and went, no, and just went back and excavated in the cemetery, which is one of the reasons why we're excavating in the settlement area, because Petrie just didn't bother. The area had already been cleared out. He identified Ptolemaic tower houses. I actually believe him, because we found the basement levels of some of his Ptolemaic tower houses, because of course they've been completely worn away today. And what we're finding now is the Persian period and late period structures underneath, sort of one step down. So that's the site. I mean, economically, it was very important. Politically, it's very important, for controlling that part of the Nile Delta during the late period. And also, interestingly, during the 26th dynasty in particular, we seem to have a fair number of elite late period burials belonging to very high-ranking military personnel. And I do wonder whether these might be various commanders who are actually living and spending most of their lives at Pelusium, but are buried at Tell Nabasha.
Probably I will ask you by email or something questions about the tower houses, because I'm doing my own research about about that. So
Fantastic.
so probably I will ask you later. And your recent discovery has attracted attention. Could you tell us about it and its broader implications for our understanding of the late period or Ptolemaic Egypt?
So really, there's two kind of components. So these are the results of our last excavation. So one is the identification of a number of tower houses. Now they're not exactly uncommon in the Nile Delta, but it is. Well, it's more the associated material, really. For instance, the little cooking area with the fish stew. We found a complete copper alloy sistrum lying in the street, which my guess is it was kept in a box in one of the upper stories of one of the houses. When it collapsed, it fell into the street and the wood rotted away. But we also excavated in the temple area, where we found a very, very large, very nicely plastered limestone plaster floor, with some really significant column emplacement, more than a meter in diameter. We are not sure what this structure is. Currently, I'm sort of torn between either some kind of Ptolemaic villa, or a public bath. We know it's Ptolemaic because, very helpfully, there was a complete 2nd century BC table amphora found literally lying on the floor, along with a number of imported Samian style, but slightly earlier, where that was sort of, it probably had been on the upper story and had actually collapsed onto the floor. The structure seems to have been destroyed in a fire. There was a lot of fire, and a lot of burning. So whatever was on the upper levels probably came crashing down in onto the plastered floor, and that's pretty much how we found it. Now, what's really interesting for me is that this structure was built directly across the processional route that links the pylon of the Temenos wall with the temple pylon. So whatever this structure was, it basically stopped any kind of procession between the temple of Wajet and the settlement itself. And we know from late period texts that there were processions, both of Wadjet and Min Osiris. So that stopped during the Ptolemaic period because someone put a building in the way, basically. But this also seems to fit with what we have in the other trench because we excavated a large cereal processing area with a huge mortar, more than a meter tall, very, very big limestone mortar, very heavy thing, that had been carved probably from a single block of limestone taken from the temple. And actually, the flooring of the cereal processing area was made up of limestone fragments, some of them decorated with relief from the temple. They'd even taken limestone columns and literally cut slices off the column and used for flooring. That fits with Petrie's suspicion that by the Persian period, so by the end of the late period, the temple had basically fallen out of use and it had become a quarry. Because in the delta, limestone is pretty hard to come by, so you take whatever you can. So this fits really with what we're finding. The temple is pulled down, the stone is recycled. By the Ptolemaic period, a number of villas and elite buildings are actually beginning to spread into the temple area within the temenos wall of the temple, including blocking up the processional route. That part of town is then destroyed in a fire. And that fits with what Petrie found as well. He found a whole burnt building from the mid-Ptolemaic period. And that fire seems to be so significant that the settlement is essentially abandoned until the Roman period. And when it's resettled, it's only resettled in the form of a very small village. So Imet, ancient Imet, effectively ends in the mid-Ptolemaic period with this catastrophic fire. What I find interesting is what happened. What about the temple? What about the religious life? If the temple has fallen out of use, where are people worshiping stuff? And I think the solution might be something that Petrie found in the cemetery, which is on the other side of the site. He found something that he refers to as the ruined limestone building, which is, well, it's basically a building that was so destroyed that even the foundations were damaged. There was almost nothing left except chips of limestone. But when he dug into the four corners of the building, he found four foundation deposits. And those foundation deposits, in terms of makeup and material, are identical to the foundation deposits of Ptolemy I at Naucratis. So I suspect that that ruined limestone building is the new temple, that the Ptolemies came along and they built a temple on the other side of the site because the original temple had basically been destroyed during the Persian period and used as a quarry.
And what kind of team do you work with at Tell Nabasha? Do students or early career researchers participate in the project?
Currently not. PhD students, yes. So we work with two PhD students from the last season with two PhD students from UCLA. We have a finds registrar from the University of Liverpool, and obviously I function as the director, and the deputy director is Dr. Hamada Hussein from Sadat City University. And then, of course, we work with Kuftis so Kufti professional excavators from Kuft and Thebes, our race, Omar Farouk, and members of the local community as well.
Mm-hmm. And now we're going to go to another topic, your teaching and public engagement. So you also teach on the online master in Egyptology at the University of Manchester. What is your experience like working with distance learning students?
It's extremely rewarding. I love the fact that the cohorts that we have are incredibly diverse. So I think the masters, we founded it in 2019. And so we've had 6-7 years now, 6-7 cohorts, and I think we've covered every continent except Antarctica, in terms of student location. So it's very it's very challenging, but in a very good way. You know, you have students from all over the world, lots of different perspectives. They come from, obviously, they all have relevant academic backgrounds, whatever that may be, you know, the degrees in related subjects. But, you know, one might have studied ancient history with a focus on Latin America, another on, you know, studied history with a focus on German monarchism. So, you know, and it brings together a lot of perspectives, and that I think can be really challenging in a good way. It can create a lot of interesting discussions and a lot of interesting conversations. So I think that that's the real strength of the MA, that it brings together quite large cohorts from all over the world, including from places where it's just not really feasible to study Egyptology because the nearest university that offers Egyptology might be very far away.
I can imagine. And have you found that your fieldwork or research fits into your teaching or even vice versa?
Oh, all the time, yeah. Universities have this thing where they love to divide between research and teaching, like they're two different things. If your teaching isn't influenced by your research, it's going to become stale because there's nothing new about it. You're just repeating old news, essentially. So I think you can't really have good teaching without having some kind of research input into it. By the same token, you can get really interesting ideas and ideas about directions of research from, yeah, chatting to students, even leading seminars. You know, I teach a unit on Egyptian social life, where the seminars usually take the form. We go through a text and discuss different kind of social lessons that we can learn from that text. It could be, you know, the Neferhotep stela, one of the miscellanies, you know, lots of different, and, you know, having these conversations with a bunch of, you know, second or third year students, occasionally someone will say something that I just didn't think of. No matter how many times I've read that text, I'll go, actually, you might have a point there, you know, and that kind of, that's part of it as well, you know, that having those conversations can also influence the way that you think as a researcher and the way that you direct your research.
Absolutely. Authored several books on Egyptian history and culture. What audience do you aim to reach with your publications? And how do you balance academic rigor with accessibility?
I mean, as many as possible, ideally. I think that there's a, as a field, we maybe have surrendered the kind of popular space a little bit too hastily, um, which unfortunately has given space to lots of pseudoscientific nonsense. So I think the more people you can reach, the better, really, because it's fascinating stories. Reality is sometimes far more interesting than some pseudoscientific twaddle that's sort of reheated 19th century mysticism. You know, often reality can be much more interesting than that, but you need to communicate it in an interesting way. Um, I think that is possible to do while, you know, maintaining academic rigor. It does mean that occasionally you have to kind of get off the fence. We're academics, we love prevaricating and we love putting lots of maybes and perhapses in our sentences, so we don't really ever, we can't
Yeah.
really be held responsible. So you sometimes you can't do that if you're writing for the public. You have to take a position, and that can be a bit challenging because it makes you feel a bit exposed. But that's part of it in writing in that slightly more narrative engaging manner.
I totally agree. You take risks, but I also think that reality is far more interesting than this fake news or this kind of sort of scientific approaches. I think reality is much more interesting, but it requires also more effort, and that is the problem with the general public, that they just read the headline of an article at a newspaper or in on TikTok or something, and that's it, and they don't have the time, or they don't take the time to go further. So that's the idea that sticks to their minds, and that's it.
Yeah, but that's where, you know, as academics, that where we have to figure out ways of getting around that, because otherwise I completely agree with you, but otherwise we end up in a situation. It's a bit like politicians complaining about the voters. Well, the voters are the voters. You can't change that. And I think so. A couple of years ago, for instance, I got a chance to go on the YouTube channel of a fairly well-known YouTube gamer who sort of does Let's Plays, but with Total War. And when Total War came out with their, I can't remember, Fair Ramses edition, something ancient Egypt, the company that produced the game reached out to me and said, look, can you maybe do something like a collaboration with this YouTuber, and you can try to recreate the Battle of Kadesh in the game. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, genuinely a lot of fun because we were kind of doing as we do now. He was kind of running the game, and we tried to run the Battle of Kadesh in all these different permutations, and set it up in different ways, and to try to basically get the AI in the game to act the way that we think the battle went. Which is difficult because we don't totally know how the battle went. But it was a lot of fun. People learned a little bit about the Battle of Kadesh, a little bit about what the Hittites were, and about Ramesses. The in-game version of Ramesses II kept running away in the battle, which I found endlessly amusing. That the royal guard and the king were always heading for the hills the moment we started the simulation. So like I think you can reach, and we ended up that reached tens of thousands of viewers. So you can do it, but you just have to kind of meet people on their playing field.
I'm going to look it up. It sounds interesting and fun.
It was quite fun, yeah.
Okay, okay. And about the future, in your view, what are some of the major challenges or opportunities facing Egyptology today in the field or in academia?
I mean, so one of the major challenges is always is funding. The funding landscape is not getting better. Lots of state funding is getting cut. Budgets are being cut. That's always challenging because it becomes more difficult to do things, even quite minor things. There's less funding for PhDs as well, which will maybe not create problems right now, but will create problems in the future for the field as a whole. So those are, I think, some of the kind of major challenges. Things like pseudoscience, pseudohistory, those are also obviously, well, I wouldn't say necessarily challenges, but they are things that we sooner or later will have to deal with in one way or another, or at least have to engage with, because it's not getting quieter. Let's put it like that. Um, in terms of opportunities, I think well, there's a couple of things here. There is still so much material, so much stuff, essentially, which is either coming out of the ground or is lying in storerooms or museums. We haven't even really scratched the surface of a lot of this material. So there is so much, I think, to be gained from going back and looking again at things that we've already looked at, albeit very cursorily. And I think a lot of interesting research can come out of that. So kind of greater collaboration between museums and universities, scientific institutes, the different actors in the field. I think that would be really, really helpful as well.
Regarding all this, what advice would you offer to students or young researchers interested in participating in archaeological fieldwork in Egypt?
Get a special skill that isn't just excavating. Whether that's object illustration, photography, have something other than I know how to excavate, because pretty much everyone does. If you're an archaeologist, that's literally the basic requirement. So on the missions in Egypt and elsewhere as well, of course, you very rarely only wear one hat, right? You have to be able to be flexible and help in different scenarios and different situations. And if you, for instance, know how to draw pottery, fantastic, because we always need people who can draw pottery. That doesn't mean you're just, we're just going to park you in the tent for 4 weeks and then you do nothing but draw pottery. That's a bit mean. But it's useful to be able to reach out to a field director and say, hey, I'd really love to join you in wherever you are. Can I go on the security list? I have experience doing X, Y, and Z, just so it isn't a case of I know how to dig holes because yeah, so do we all. So having something that bringing something else to the table. I usually encourage my students to at least do a little bit of object illustration and pottery illustration, because they are pretty useful skills, and they're also skills with if you're a really good object illustrator, if you can do things like photo artifact drawings and stuff like that. I mean, that's not a bad way to make money in some situations as well. You can earn a little cash on that because people will pay you, publishers will pay you for illustrations and stuff like that. So there are, there are tools that you can use to make it more likely. The other thing I would say is to don't, and this is something I've come across in students before, don't look down on doing archaeology elsewhere. Just because you're an Egyptologist, if you get a chance to go and excavate in Turkey or in France, go excavate in Turkey or in France, because that will give you practical experience, which you can then parlay into to field work in Egypt. I excavated in Turkey and the UK long before I ever set foot in Egypt on an excavation. But those kind of skills, they're pretty universal. And yeah, the more practice you can get, the more experience you can get, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to be able to change to adapt to different environments or
Yeah.
different circumstances, because I think they give you a different experience. And if you have been focused during all your career on a certain topic or a certain area, you're going to have a narrower perspective about the job. So yeah, I think that's an interesting advice, and I'm going to note that for myself also in the future. So thank you very much. I hope we can talk to you again soon, maybe after your next season or
Hopefully.
whenever you want to come to talk to us. You're more than welcome. It was a pleasure, and thank you very much. And good luck with everything.
Thank you.